In the sweltering heat of a Philippine jungle in April 1942, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers began what would become known as one of history's most brutal forced marches. But this was only the beginning. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater, a systematic campaign of cruelty was unfolding that would claim the lives of nearly 1 in 4 Allied prisoners who fell into Japanese hands. While the world focused on the battlefields of Europe and the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, another nightmare was taking shape in the jungles of Burma, the camps of Manchuria, and the industrial sites scattered across the Japanese Empire. What happened in these places would challenge everything we thought we knew about the rules of war and the depths of human cruelty. This is the story of Japan's secret prisoner of war camps during World War II, where survival was not just unlikely but actively prevented by a military philosophy that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Over the next several parts, we'll uncover the systematic brutality that claimed over 21,000 American lives alone, examine the medical experiments that rivaled the worst atrocities of Nazi Germany, and hear from the few survivors who lived to tell their stories. But first, we need to understand how a nation's military culture could create conditions so horrific that Allied prisoners had a 7 times higher chance of dying in Japanese custody than under Nazi control. The answer lies not just in individual cruelty, but in a deliberate system designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance, medical care, or hope. The philosophical foundation for this brutality was embedded deep within Japanese military culture through the concept of Bushido and the 1941 Code of Battlefield Conduct, known as the Senjin-kun. This document, distributed to every Japanese soldier, contained a simple but devastating principle. Surrender was forbidden. To die for emperor, family, and nation represented the highest honor a soldier could achieve. Choosing captivity over death brought shame not only to the individual, but to their entire family lineage. This cultural framework created a psychological distance between Japanese guards and their Allied prisoners that went far beyond typical wartime animosity. In the Japanese military mind, these men had already committed the ultimate act of cowardice by surrendering. They had forfeited their right to be treated as honorable soldiers or even as human beings deserving basic dignity. What followed was a systematic dehumanization that would make the next 3.5 years a living hell for those unfortunate enough to be captured. The scale of Japanese prisoner operations was staggering in both scope and geographic reach. Across their vast Pacific empire, the Japanese military established over 160 camps within the home islands alone, with additional facilities scattered throughout Formosa, Korea, Manchuria, China, Burma, and Thailand. These weren't temporary holding facilities, but permanent installations designed to extract forced labor from a captive workforce that the Japanese viewed as completely expendable. The journey to these camps began with capture itself, often following battles where Japanese forces had shown no mercy to those attempting to surrender. Those who survived the initial capture faced transport conditions deliberately designed to weaken and demoralize them before they even reached their final destinations. The so-called hell ships that carried prisoners across the Pacific created floating chambers of death where men were packed into cargo holds with no ventilation, minimal food and water, and no sanitation facilities. Gregory Michno's research reveals that more than 126,000 Allied prisoners were transported on these vessels, with over 21,000 Americans killed or injured during the voyages themselves. Many died from the deliberate neglect of their Japanese captors, while others perished when Allied submarines and aircraft, unaware that the unmarked cargo ships contained their own countrymen, attacked what appeared to be legitimate military targets. The conditions aboard these transport vessels provided a preview of what awaited prisoners at their destinations. Men were crammed into spaces originally designed for cargo, forced to relieve themselves where they sat, and given just enough food and water to keep them barely alive. The Japanese provided no life vests or safety equipment, and when ships came under attack, prisoners were often locked in the holds to prevent any possibility of escape. Upon arrival at the camps, prisoners discovered that their ordeal had only begun. The Japanese camp system operated under a deliberate policy of controlled starvation, where food rations were calculated to provide just enough nutrition to enable forced labor while ensuring gradual physical deterioration. The standard diet consisted primarily of rice and watery soup, with protein sources so rare that prisoners would fight over scraps of vegetable matter or the occasional piece of fish. Medical care was virtually non-existent, with camp doctors often using prisoners as subjects for medical experiments rather than providing treatment for tropical diseases, malnutrition, and injuries sustained during forced labor. The Japanese medical staff viewed their captives not as patients deserving care, but as experimental subjects whose suffering could advance Japanese military medicine and biological warfare research. The work assignments given to prisoners were designed not just to support the Japanese war effort, but to physically break down the captives through deliberate overwork under impossible conditions. Men suffering from dysentery, malaria, and severe malnutrition were forced to construct railways through tropical jungles, work in mines without proper safety equipment, and build military installations while being beaten for any sign of weakness or inability to maintain the required pace. The guards who supervised this forced labor were trained to view violence as an appropriate response to any perceived infraction. Beatings with bamboo clubs, rifle butts, and steel rods were routine punishments for infractions as minor as failing to bow properly or working too slowly due to illness. More serious punishments included prolonged exposure to tropical sun without water, being forced to hold heavy objects over one's head for hours, or confinement in punishment boxes barely large enough for a human body. What made this system particularly insidious was its calculated nature. This wasn't random violence born of wartime stress, but a carefully designed program of systematic degradation intended to extract maximum labor from prisoners while ensuring that few would survive to bear witness to what they had experienced. Japanese camp commandants were given explicit instructions that no prisoner should be allowed to escape, and in the final months of the war they received orders to prepare for the complete elimination of all captives in the event of Allied invasion. The mortality statistics speak to the effectiveness of this system of deliberate cruelty. While Allied prisoners in German custody faced a death rate of approximately 4%, those held by the Japanese died at rates exceeding 27% overall, with some individual camps seeing death rates that approached 50% or higher. These statistics represented more than numbers on bureaucratic reports. They reflected a deliberate policy of extermination through exhaustion, a method that allowed the Japanese military to extract valuable labor while systematically eliminating witnesses to their crimes. Each percentage point represented thousands of individual tragedies, men who had entered captivity believing they might survive to see their families again, only to discover they had become trapped in a machine designed to consume human life. Among the most notorious examples of this systematic cruelty was the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, a project that would earn the grim nickname Death Railway from the prisoners forced to build it. In June 1942, Japanese military planners conceived an ambitious engineering project to connect existing rail lines between Burma and Thailand, creating a supply route that would support their military operations while bypassing sea lanes that had become vulnerable to Allied attack following Japanese defeats at Coral Sea and Midway. The Japanese military assembled a massive forced labor force for this undertaking, consisting of approximately 200,000 Asian conscripts and over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war. Among the Allied captives were 30,000 British soldiers, 13,000 Australians, 18,000 Dutch prisoners, and 700 Americans. These men, already weakened by months of captivity and inadequate nutrition, were transported to remote jungle locations where they would spend the next 16 months constructing 258 miles of railway through some of the most challenging terrain in Southeast Asia. The construction route traversed dense tropical jungle, crossed numerous rivers and gorges, and required cutting through solid rock formations using primitive tools and explosives. Working parties were assigned sections of track to complete under impossible deadlines, with Japanese and Korean guards using systematic violence to maintain the required pace of construction. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours daily in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. During monsoon seasons that turned jungle paths into impassable quagmires, and through the dry season when dust and heat created conditions resembling a blast furnace. The tools provided for this massive engineering project were deliberately inadequate for the task at hand. Prisoners were given bamboo baskets to move tons of earth and rock, primitive hammers and chisels to break through stone formations, and shovels so worn that they frequently broke under the strain of heavy use. When prisoners requested proper equipment or complained about the impossibility of meeting their quotas with such tools, guards responded with beatings and reduced food rations. Medical care along the railway was virtually non-existent, with camp hospitals consisting of bamboo huts without proper sanitation, medical supplies, or trained personnel. Prisoners suffering from tropical diseases including malaria, dysentery, cholera, and beriberi were forced to continue working until they physically collapsed. Those deemed too sick to work were often denied food rations entirely, creating a vicious cycle where illness led to starvation, which led to death. The Japanese guards and engineers supervising the railway construction had been specifically instructed that the project must be completed on schedule regardless of the human cost. When progress fell behind the projected timeline, guards increased the violence of their punishments and extended working hours even further. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten with bamboo clubs, rifle butts, and steel rods. Those who protested the impossibility of their assigned tasks faced punishment details that often proved fatal. One particularly brutal practice involved forcing prisoners to stand at attention in the tropical sun for hours without water while holding heavy rocks or logs above their heads. Men who allowed their arms to drop were beaten and forced to begin again. Another common punishment required prisoners to dig their own graves and stand in them overnight, with guards threatening execution for any movement. These psychological torture methods were designed not just to punish individual infractions, but to terrorize the entire prisoner population into compliance. The death toll along the death railway reflected the systematic nature of Japanese cruelty. More than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war perished during the construction project, including over 2,700 Australians. The number of Asian forced laborers who died was never accurately recorded, but estimates suggest that up to 90,000 conscripts perished alongside their Allied counterparts. This represented a death rate approaching 1 in 3 among the entire workforce. The bodies of those who died were typically buried in shallow graves along the railway route, with no markers or records to identify the locations. Survivors later reported that the jungle was filled with unmarked burial sites where prisoners had been hastily interred before work resumed the following day. The Japanese kept no official records of these deaths, viewing the deceased prisoners as expendable resources rather than human beings whose lives had meaning and value. As construction neared completion in October 1943, the survivors found themselves in a paradoxical situation. Those who had managed to stay alive through 16 months of systematic brutality discovered that their usefulness to the Japanese war effort was diminishing. Rather than providing better conditions for the remaining prisoners, camp commandants began implementing policies designed to eliminate potential witnesses to what had occurred along the railway. The completion of the death railway marked not an end to prisoner suffering, but a transition to new forms of exploitation and abuse. Surviving prisoners were redistributed to other forced labor projects throughout the Japanese Empire, where they would face similar conditions of deliberate starvation, medical neglect, and systematic violence. The railway itself would operate for less than 2 years, before Allied bombing campaigns rendered it largely unusable, making the enormous human sacrifice completely meaningless from a strategic perspective. Meanwhile, in the remote regions of occupied Manchuria, an even more sinister operation was taking place behind the facade of medical research and public health. Unit 731, officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, represented perhaps the most systematic program of human experimentation in recorded history. Under the leadership of General Shiro Ishii, this facility would conduct biological warfare research and medical experiments that surpassed even the notorious medical crimes of Nazi Germany in their scope and brutality. The facility, established at Pingfang outside Harbin in occupied Manchuria, appeared from the outside to be a legitimate medical research center. With over 3,000 personnel, 150 buildings, and the capacity to hold 600 prisoners simultaneously for experimental purposes. Unit 731 represented the industrialization of human suffering disguised as scientific advancement. General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant physician and bacteriologist, had convinced Japanese military leadership that biological warfare could provide their forces with a decisive advantage in their conquest of Asia. The selection of subjects for these experiments followed the same dehumanizing logic that governed Japanese prisoner camps throughout their empire. Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, and other captives were transported to the facility under the cover story that it was a lumber mill. The staff referred to human subjects as logs, a term that originated as dark humor but reflected the complete objectification of their victims. Dr. Harris Sheldon's research suggests that between 10,000 and 12,000 prisoners died in these biological experiments, though the true number may never be known. The experimental procedures conducted at Unit 731 were designed to advance Japanese understanding of biological warfare while treating human subjects as laboratory animals. Prisoners were deliberately infected with bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, and other deadly pathogens to study disease progression and test potential treatments. Unlike legitimate medical research, these experiments were conducted without any consideration for the welfare of the subjects, who were viewed as expendable resources in service of Japanese military objectives. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato specialized in hypothermia research, regularly subjecting prisoners to extreme cold exposure to study human responses to frostbite. Prisoners would have their limbs submerged in ice water until frozen solid, with researchers timing the process and documenting the physical changes that occurred. Witnesses later testified that frozen limbs produced a sound like wooden planks when struck, revealing the complete loss of human tissue integrity that these experiments produced. Other research projects included deliberate starvation studies, dehydration experiments, and exposure to extreme air pressure that typically killed subjects when they were subjected to forces between 10 and 15 times normal gravity. Vivisection procedures were performed on conscious subjects without anesthesia, with researchers examining internal organs while prisoners remained alive to observe physiological responses in real time. The scale and systematic nature of these experiments reflected careful planning and institutional support from the highest levels of Japanese military command. Unlike the improvised cruelty that characterized many prisoner camps, Unit 731 operated as a sophisticated research institution with detailed protocols, careful documentation, and scientific methodologies applied to fundamentally inhumane objectives. The facility included laboratories, surgical theaters, and specialized equipment that would have been impressive in any legitimate medical setting. The broader network of biological warfare research extended beyond Unit 731 to include subsidiary units throughout occupied China and Southeast Asia. These facilities conducted similar experiments while also developing practical applications for biological agents that could be deployed against civilian populations. Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, contaminated water supplies with cholera bacteria, and distributed poisoned food to test the effectiveness of various biological weapons. The documentation produced by these research programs was extensive and detailed, with researchers maintaining careful records of experimental procedures, subject responses, and mortality rates. This scientific approach to mass murder created a bureaucracy of death that paralleled the administrative efficiency found in the most notorious Nazi facilities. The difference lay not in the methods employed, but in the complete absence of international scrutiny that allowed Japanese biological warfare research to continue unobserved throughout the war. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese military planners faced the growing possibility that their prisoner facilities might be discovered and their crimes exposed to international judgment. The response was not to improve conditions or cease the systematic abuse of captives, but to accelerate plans for the complete elimination of all witnesses to Japanese war crimes. In 1944, the Japanese War Ministry issued explicit orders to all camp commandants regarding the final disposition of their prisoners. These instructions stated that in the event of Allied invasion, camp commanders should annihilate them all and not allow the escape of a single one. Prisoners in camps across the empire were forced to dig mass graves during the preceding weeks, unaware that they were preparing their own burial sites. The systematic nature of this planned genocide reflected the same administrative efficiency that had characterized Japanese prisoner operations throughout the war. Camp commanders received detailed instructions on methods of execution, body disposal, and evidence elimination. The goal was not just to kill the remaining prisoners, but to erase all traces of what had occurred in Japanese custody over the previous 3 years. This final phase of Japanese prisoner policy revealed the true nature of their treatment of Allied captives. From the beginning, the Japanese military had never intended for these men to survive the war. The systematic starvation, medical neglect, and brutal working conditions were not byproducts of wartime necessity, but deliberate policies designed to extract maximum labor while ensuring eventual elimination of all witnesses. The planned massacre was prevented only by Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, which came just weeks before many camps were scheduled to implement their final orders. Prisoners who had survived years of systematic abuse suddenly found themselves liberated by Allied forces who were shocked by the conditions they discovered. The contrast between German and Japanese prisoner facilities was immediately apparent to military investigators who documented death rates and treatment conditions that exceeded even the worst Nazi concentration camps in their systematic cruelty. In the remote jungles of North Borneo, another tragedy was unfolding that would represent the single greatest atrocity committed against Australian forces in any war. The Sandakan prisoner camp had been established in 1942 to house approximately 2,700 Australian and British prisoners, most of whom had been captured during the fall of Singapore. For nearly 3 years, these men had endured conditions similar to those found in Japanese camps throughout the empire. Systematic starvation, medical neglect, and forced labor under impossible conditions. By early 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands, camp commanders received orders to relocate their prisoners to prevent their liberation by approaching Allied troops. The solution was a series of forced marches from Sandakan to Ranao, a distance of over 100 miles through dense tropical jungle and mountainous terrain. These marches would become known as the Sandakan Death Marches, and they represented perhaps the most systematic example of Japanese efforts to eliminate prisoner witnesses. The first march began in January 1945, with Japanese guards selecting 470 prisoners who were considered fit enough to carry supplies and equipment for the accompanying Japanese units. The men chosen for this march were already suffering from severe malnutrition and tropical diseases, having endured nearly 3 years of systematic abuse in the Sandakan camp. They were given rations sufficient for only 4 days, though the journey was expected to take 9 days under the best conditions. The route traversed some of the most challenging terrain in Southeast Asia, including wide marshlands that turned into impassable swamps during the monsoon season, dense jungle where the canopy blocked out most sunlight, and steep mountain slopes that challenged even healthy individuals. The prisoners, many weighing less than 80 pounds due to prolonged starvation, were forced to carry heavy packs while maintaining a pace that ensured the weakest would quickly fall behind. Japanese guards had received explicit instructions that no prisoner was to reach the final destination alive. Any man who showed signs of exhaustion, illness, or inability to maintain the required pace was immediately executed by bayonet or gunshot. The bodies were dragged a few meters into the jungle and left unburied, with the march continuing without pause. Survivors later testified that the sound of gunshots became a constant accompaniment to their journey, as guards systematically eliminated those who could no longer keep up. Of the 470 prisoners who began the first march, only 195 survived to reach Ranao. Those who completed the journey discovered that their ordeal was far from over. The camp at Ranao provided even worse conditions than Sandakan, with virtually no food, medical care, or shelter from the elements. Prisoners continued to die daily from starvation and disease, while Japanese guards maintained the same brutal discipline that had characterized their treatment throughout captivity. The second and third death marches followed similar patterns, with Japanese commanders selecting additional groups of prisoners for elimination through forced marching under impossible conditions. Each successive march saw even higher mortality rates as the remaining prisoners were progressively weaker and the Japanese guards became more systematic in their elimination of stragglers. By the end of the war, only 6 Australian soldiers had survived the Sandakan camp and death marches out of nearly 3,000 who had been imprisoned there. This represented a survival rate of less than 1%, making it the most complete destruction of any Allied prisoner population during World War II. The few survivors owed their lives not to Japanese mercy but to their ability to escape into the jungle during the final weeks of captivity. The systematic nature of the Sandakan death marches reflected the same administrative efficiency that characterized Japanese prisoner operations throughout their empire. Guards maintained detailed records of prisoner movements, execution sites, and body disposal methods. The goal was not simply to kill the prisoners, but to ensure that no trace remained of their existence or the crimes committed against them. The discovery of these atrocities by Allied investigators revealed the extent to which Japanese military culture had embraced systematic murder as a solution to the problem of prisoner testimony. Unlike the improvised violence that occurred in many wartime situations, the elimination of Allied prisoners represented a carefully planned policy implemented with bureaucratic precision across multiple theaters of operation. The aftermath of these systematic atrocities would reveal a pattern of cover-up and denial that extended far beyond the end of hostilities. As Allied forces liberated camp after camp, they encountered a deliberate campaign to erase all evidence of what had transpired during 3.5 years of systematic brutality. Japanese military units had spent the final weeks of the war destroying documents, dismantling facilities, and eliminating physical traces of their crimes. The most egregious example of this cover-up involved Unit 731 and the broader biological warfare program. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied occupation forces, made a decision that would haunt historical justice for decades. Rather than prosecuting the architects of biological warfare experiments, American authorities granted immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research data. The rationale was coldly pragmatic. The information gathered through systematic human experimentation was deemed too valuable to lose to war crimes tribunals. Dr. Shiro Ishii and his associates were quietly integrated into American biological warfare research programs, their crimes forgotten in service of Cold War strategic interests. The extensive documentation of human experiments, carefully maintained throughout the war, was classified and hidden from public view. For nearly 4 decades, the Japanese government denied that Unit 731 had ever existed, dismissing survivor testimonies as wartime propaganda. This institutional amnesia extended beyond biological warfare to encompass the broader scope of Japanese prisoner abuse. While Nazi war criminals faced extensive prosecution at Nuremberg and subsequent trials, the systematic nature of Japanese atrocities remained largely unexposed. Many camp commandants and guards simply returned to civilian life, their identities protected by the chaos of post-war reconstruction and the American focus on rebuilding Japan as a strategic ally. The voices of the few who survived these camps carry a responsibility that extends far beyond their own experiences. They speak not only for themselves, but for the hundreds of thousands who perished in unmarked graves, their stories silenced by systematic cruelty and deliberate erasure. The statistics tell us that over 27% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese custody, but each percentage point represents individual human beings who entered captivity with hopes of returning home to their families. Today, as the last survivors pass away and their testimonies become historical documents rather than living memory, we face the same obligation that confronts every generation: to ensure that these crimes are neither forgotten nor repeated. The systematic nature of Japanese prisoner abuse was not the product of individual sadism or wartime chaos, but of institutional policies implemented with bureaucratic efficiency across an entire empire. The parallels between different systems of systematic dehumanization remind us that such atrocities are not confined to any single culture or historical period. They emerge when societies create psychological distance between themselves and those they deem expendable, when bureaucratic structures enable the normalization of cruelty, and when the testimony of victims is systematically suppressed or denied. Understanding these mechanisms serves not to assign collective guilt, but to recognize the conditions that make such crimes possible. The philosophical frameworks that enabled Japanese military culture to view surrender as disgrace, the administrative systems that reduced human beings to expendable resources, and the cover-up efforts that sought to erase all evidence of systematic murder represent warning signs that transcend any single historical moment. The responsibility of remembrance extends beyond simple commemoration to active vigilance against the forces that enable systematic dehumanization in any form. When we hear the testimonies of survivors, we are not passive consumers of historical information, but witnesses to witness testimony, carrying forward the obligation to ensure these voices are never silenced by time or deliberate forgetting. In honoring those who perished in Japanese prisoner camps, we affirm that their suffering was not meaningless, and that their memory serves as both memorial and warning. The machinery of systematic cruelty that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives was defeated not by its own limitations, but by the courage of those who refused to surrender their humanity even under impossible conditions. These stories demand from us not just remembrance, but commitment to the principles that such cruelty sought to destroy. Recognition of human dignity regardless of nationality or circumstance, adherence to international law even under the pressures of conflict, and the courage to speak truth about systematic injustice even when that truth challenges comfortable narratives about the past. The camps are gone, their barracks dismantled, their mass graves unmarked and overgrown. But the testimony remains, preserved in the words of survivors and the documentation of investigators who refuse to let these crimes disappear into historical silence. In carrying these stories forward, we ensure that the attempt to erase them has not succeeded.